All right, hey, welcome. This is first lecture here with our government class, Salina Tech government class, first chapter. Let's just run through this real quick. It's not too complex. It's a lot of review. It's pretty short here, so here we go. When we're looking at government, what do we mean? This is a government class. What are we going to be studying? Basically, what we're looking at when we look at government is we're looking at the ways in which society organizes itself, how it's going to regulate and allocate its authority, how that authority is going to turn around and bring about the goals or the collective goals of society, and how's it going to benefit everybody. If you go back to the earliest civilizations, we look at governments from a historical perspective, starting somewhere probably in Mesopotamia, where you had water irrigation systems that needed to be accomplished and grain storage that needed to be accomplished to ensure food supplies for the people that lived in those areas. And that was the job of the government, or that was the job of the king. And that's basically how governments came about. Collectively, humanity had a goal that was too large for one person to carry this out. And it was distributed. People gave up some of their individualism to a higher source, a higher power, and in return for that, some of their goals or needs were met. So that's what we're looking at with the government. Okay, what does politics mean? How does the book define politics? Well, the book is going to define politics as gaining and exercising control within a government. And that can be done for whatever reason someone wants to gain or exercise control. But the game of politics is all about power. You can enter into politics to get a bill passed, to gain access to, I think that's mining rights on national public lands. All right, so maybe that's your goal, or you want to influence a politician to pass a law for you. You can change a tax law. You can enter into politics without being a politician. It just typically takes money or influence, and so that's where we are there. Defining government. Government systems are not economic systems, but they're typically closely they're related. The book spends, a couple of pages talking about the idea of capitalism and socialism or communism. And it's important to draw a distinction that democracy and capitalism are not the same thing, although they kind of developed hand in hand. And in a lot of ways are probably pretty good twin brothers, but they're not. Capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production and the choice to enter and exit the marketplace at any time, and allowing the marketplace to set the prices, while democracy typically is seen as a form of government which represents the will of the people. Those are two totally different ideas. When we look at communism, communism gets a little bit more tricky, because communism and socialism, the governments of communism, aren't necessarily the governments or the economic system of communism, but it's really kind of so interwoven that it's really kind of hard to separate the two. Where socialism, I think that there's definitely differences between socialism and communism, but the fact we're just going to lump those together right now and just say that communism and socialism as a government and as an economic system kind of, again, go hand in hand, where the government owns the means of production. So you don't have private ownership, and they control what is produced and how much. And so there's not as much innovation or change, I guess, in the marketplace. It's not the government, the government owns a factory, they're going to make TVs, and they're going to make 1,000 TVs, and they're going to sell them for $100 a piece. So whoever runs that factory really has no incentive to make a better TV than what will just sell in the marketplace. And so, like, you can go back and look at the history of the Soviet Union, and one of the problems in the 1970s, 1980s in the Soviet Union was exploding televisions, because the materials they were using were so flammable that they would explode and cause apartment fires. And there was no reason for them to change, because there was no market. Now, book talks a lot about Sweden in this chapter, where we have a democratic socialist government like Sweden, where you do have private ownership of the means of production, but the government plays a very heavy role in the well-being of its people through democratic socialist programs, such as basically high tax rates and redistribution of wealth through social programs. It's also probably important to note that not every country, it's going to be very rare to see a purely democratic country or a purely capitalist country or a purely communist country with a purely communist economy. Typically, you're going to have some kind of mixed economy, just like in the United States. Although we're democratic and capitalist, we have certain socialist programs like Social Security, education, public education. We have social welfare programs like Medicaid to help out the poor, Medicare to help out the elderly with medical problems or medical insurance. So you have a lot of overlap there. Okay, democracy is just a political system in which people govern themselves. A lot of times in the Western world, this is also going to involve capitalism. In the United States, we're a domestic, or we're a democratic a representative democracy. Okay, so in the United States, we're a representative democracy. Capitalism, we'll look at this. Typically, it's attributed, the idea of capitalism is attributed to this gentleman by the name of Adam Smith, who wrote a book. He's a Scottish philosopher. He's a product of the Enlightenment. And he wrote a book in 1776 where basically he argues that people should be free to acquire property in any way they want. They can use that property however they want. If they get, 1 million acres of land, they can start a farm, or they can just let stuff fallow. That they get to choose what to do with that. If they own a factory, they can make televisions, they can make cars, they can make slide whistles, whatever the person that runs the factory believes would be best suited for the marketplace. And whatever they sell or whatever they can bring to market, they should be able to keep their profits. He also believes in specialization. In 1776, a lot of people are going to live on subsistent farms in which everybody's going to try to grow everything they need to survive. And Smith says, hey, that's probably not the best idea, because you could have one guy that's really good at making furniture and tables, but he's lousy with growing corn. So he should use all of his energy and time to make tables and sell those to the guy that probably is a much better farmer, but not as good of carpenter. And so the gentleman that would waste his time with making tables should spend his time growing corn and then sell his excess corn on market and use that money to buy tables from the gentleman that is a better carpenter. And therefore the carpenter would go to the marketplace and buy corn, and the farmer would go to the marketplace and buy tables. Competition would ensue that the price remains low because there's going to be a couple of guys that make tables. And so you're going to want to make sure that you bring the best table to marketplace that you can. And if you make a crappy table, people are going to stop buying your stuff. And so that's basically the idea that Smith believes the government should stay out of the marketplace and the market will regulate itself. It's the idea of the invisible hand in the marketplace. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later. Socialism or communism, as it later evolves into, is an idea that's brought about by Karl Marx. Marx writes a number of books in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And basically Marx's ideas are in response to the capitalism or the evils of capitalism, if you want to go that far, of the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Marx is born in Germany, grows up in Switzerland, is in England when England starts to industrialize, and he sees the plights of the urban workers and the displacement of people off of the farms, and the wealth that's being generated by the people that own factories, but not being given back to the people that are working in those factories. And so Marx basically argues that the means of wealth and production should be owned by a government, and that banks and farms and large farms and factories should all be owned by the government or a collective of people. And those people should decide what they're going to make and how much they should sell those products for. The government should make that wealth and then redistribute redistribute it to their people through social programs like healthcare, education, childcare. And then the government should own things like utilities and transportation and communication lines and those types of things. And so Marx was really just the guy that kind of put this idea together, just like Adam Smith is just the guy that puts together this idea of capitalism. Smith actually gets to see capitalism unfold. Marx is long gone before we have the communist revolution in Russia. And so therefore, Marx never actually sees his idea comes to place. And can never make any changes to his ideas. When capitalism or socialism is oftentimes implemented into society, it's controlled by an oligarchy, which is a small group of ruling elites that oversee the marketplace and the business and the government. The book uses the example of China for that. The exception to this would be Sweden, which is a democratic socialist nation. Okay, what we're looking at, when we're really looking at this idea of capitalism, socialism, we're looking at the idea of private goods versus public goods. What are private goods? Well, private goods are things that you own: food, clothing, housing, and then public goods. These are goods that are going to be provided by the government: national security, education, transportation, roads, police, fire, those types of things. You also have private goods that are provided for those that can't afford them through welfare programs like food stamps, Medicaid, with healthcare, those types of things. You also have this idea that the book talks about in toll goods. Toll goods are basically goods that are available to all people, but they're at a price. Example would be private education. Everybody's free to go to a private institute, a private university. It just costs more. I don't know. You could say that a toll good would probably be a vehicle, maybe at this point, that you could get from place to place through public transportation. But and then you also have this idea of common goods. How are those going to be regulated? Things that are all people can use, but they need to be regulated, like fish and game or clean drinking water. Those types of ideas. Okay, book talks about types of governments. We have the United States can be best described as a republic, probably more so a representative democracy. Republic is just a nation that's based on laws. It's not subject to the wild swings of opinion of the majority, although the will of the majority typically rules. In a republic, you have this idea of minority rights. In the United States, we have a representative democracy in which citizens elect representatives to make our decisions. And so we send, each state sends at least one representative to Congress. In Kansas, we send 4, depending on where you are in Kansas. You have a representative. I live in the 1st District of Kansas, so we have Tracy Mann that represents us. And then we have 2 senators that we send to Washington as well, which would be Robert Marshall and Jerry Moran. And then we also, we elect a president. We elect a president. We elect those people. We elect local representatives on the local level. We elect a governor, a mayor, so forth and so on. Okay. We talked about that. Most representative governments come up with this idea of majority rules. The majority rules who's empowered to make these laws. However, there are laws in place or rights in place that protect the rights of the minorities. The book gives an example of religious freedom of religion, basically guaranteeing the rights for people to be atheists or to practice a religion that's not commonly practiced by the majority. The United States is a majority Christian nation, but we do have guarantees of freedom of religion. So if you want to be a Muslim, if you want to be a practicing Jew, if you want to be an atheist, if you want to be practice Wicca or whatever, you have a constitutional right to do so, and that can't be made illegal. Okay, direct democracies are different than representative democracies. Representative democracies means that we elect people to go to Washington and act on our behalf. Direct democracy basically means that people take part in every decision made in the government. Today, governments are too complex for direct democracies to actually take place. Probably the closest you're going to see is in Switzerland, and they have frequent national elections to approve or disapprove of the actions of the government. The book talks about ancient Athens and Greece being a direct democracy where white landowners could vote on the actions of the government. However, even in ancient Greece, you're looking at a small percentage of the population actually being involved in the government. Government in the United States actually does have some direct democracy elements that get added during the progressive period of the United States. We have things like referendum, which the government will allow people to vote on a particular law. If something is typically controversial, it will go to a referendum, so that way elected officials don't have to face political fallout for that. So like if you're going to have typically like legalization of marijuana laws typically always come about through referendum because politicians don't want to vote on an issue that would possibly upset their constituency. You have recall votes, like in California, the state recently tried to recall their governor. Basically, if a politician is not doing an acceptable job, if you get enough signatures on a petition, you can put that person's elected position up for a recall vote. And if the majority of people vote to recall that person or to remove him from a position, then you can reopen that position for election. And then you have initiative, where if you get enough people to sign a petition, you can put an idea on a ballot to go before the lawmaking body. So let's say you want to outlaw bananas. You get enough people to sign a bill that outlaws bananas, like in the city of Hutchinson, then you could get that up for vote and then have a vote, and then that the law that you wrote up could be presented to city council or the local city government, wherever, to approve or disapprove. And they could actually take that initiative and then turn it into a referendum. So you could take a vote and to outlaw bananas again and take it to city council, and city council could turn around and they could write it into a referendum and hold it at the next local election. Okay. So we have representative democracy, we have direct democracy. You also have monarchy, which is just the rule of a one person, typically a king or a queen, that inherits that ruling from heredity. Typically, they hold total political power. Examples of monarchy in today's world are few and far between, but you have some in some of the Asian kingdoms like Saudi Arabia or Qatar. You also have constitutional monarchies where the king or queen has some power, but they're limited by constitution or by a governing body. Examples of that would be like 1700s England, 1800s England, in which the king and queen didn't get it, dang it. The king and queen are limited by parliament. You guys are probably familiar with that with your history classes in high school. You have oligarchy, which we talked about, which is just a small handful of elite people that run the government. You have totalitarianism, which is a government that is more important than the individuals, and it controls all the aspects of the citizen's life. Examples would be like North Korea. There also, totalitarianism is very, very, very similar to fascism, which you would see that the loss of individual rights. Fascism examples would be like Mussolini's Italy during World War II or Nazi Germany. Okay, so the book gives an entire section over to this idea of who really runs the government. I think it's kind of an interesting question. They propose 3 different theories. I would encourage you to read that. The first one is the elite theory, and basically this is just an argument that an elite group of people really is in charge of the United States, and others don't have a whole lot of influence. And it's some kind of this combination of military, business, and political elites, in which the wealthy use their wealth and control and connections for their own benefits. They make the argument that 5 of the past 6 presidents have come from Ivy League schools. So like both Bushes, George W. Graduates from Yale. Clinton was a Yale, I believe. Barack Obama graduated from Columbia and then Harvard Law School. Trump graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school. So, I mean, there's some fire for that smoke, but at the same time, when we're looking at the most prestigious office in the nation, obviously those offices are going to go to people that go to probably the most prestigious schools or have the most prestigious connections. And so it's not that uncommon. The book talks about the fact that like 90% of the members of the House of Representatives have a college education, and 99% of senators have a college education. Well, I mean, that's probably pretty true, that if you're going to advance into society or a higher echelon society, you're going to have the education to go along with that, or you're going to have a business background and you're going to be a successful businessman. There's not too many unsuccessful business people that rise to the office of the presidency. The exception to that would probably be Harry Truman. I think you're starting to see a decline in the prestige of the military as far as becoming president. Following the Gulf War, we didn't have the commanding general Norman Schwarzkopf. Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. Yeah, whatever. Didn't become president. Didn't move into politics. But Colin Powell did. He rose to the ranks of head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So there's always going to be military people in government. There's always going to be successful business people. There's always going to be political elites like the Bushes, the Kennedys, that are going to turn politics into a game, politics into a way of life. I think you also kind of are starting to see that with the Trump family as well. So the politicians do the bidding of the wealthy and not the ordinary people, according to this elite theory. The pluralist theory basically argues that people with shared interests form interest groups, and that's how they make their desires known to politicians. So environmental advocates, unions, groups that represent businesses. And these groups basically speak for themselves with input from the common people. The average person today isn't all that involved in politics or isn't able to spend that much time and attention involved in politics. And so these interest groups are ways to bring about political change. I think there's some truths to both of those theories. And the final theory they add off is this trade-off perspective, in which government is a series of trades and compromises where certain people want certain things done and they're willing to trade ideas on other things to get those things done. Political trade-offs and compromises have definitely declined over the past 20 years in Congress as partisanism has risen. It wasn't that uncommon in the 70s and 80s and even into the mid 90s for Democrats and Republicans to trade ideas or to trade beliefs or votes in order to get projects and bills passed that they believed in. Today, with the partisanship of Congress and the 24-hour news cycle, that's kind of starting to fall off. And so we'll see how that develops over the next decade or so. Okay. Book talks a little bit about political engagement. Less people are becoming politically engaged. One reason that they give for this is this idea of loss of social capital and the fact that our Cell phones and social media and computers allow us to connect to social groups without actually having physical in real life connections. And so people are replacing some of those connections with, or those needs to connect with social groups, or with social media. That's probably the truth. Civic engagement can increase the power of ordinary people to bring about change. Absolutely. If you get upset about something, you go out and you form a group, or you have protests or petitions, or you contact representatives and you begin to work, all of a sudden you can see about the change that you bring. The change that you bring. My wife works with a lady that ran for city council, and she didn't win, but like she got very active in the community to bring about some of the changes that she wanted to see. And so even though she didn't win her general election, she's still out there holding meetings and talking to people, talking to civic groups and whatnot. You look at civic engagement through the book's eyes. They talk about the civil rights movement and how it was more than just ensuring the right to vote for African Americans in the South. It was trying to end segregation in places like education or public facilities, and ensuring equal protection across the board. We have the representative governments. They cannot work without the participation of informed citizens. I think with the growth of the internet and the 24-hour news cycle, you're starting to see you're starting to see an assault on what the news is and what needs to be news and what isn't news. You're starting to see opinion being brought about as fact. And in fact, basically taking a back seat to opinion, and just the fact that because of the 24-hour news cycle, agencies have to be the first to get a story out. Sometimes they're not doing their job and checking sources and doing the things that they should. So this idea of informed citizenry is going to be a challenge moving forward the next 10, 15, 20 years. How's that going to look? And really, I mean, into this next midterm election, how is the news cycle and the ability to get information, what's that going to look like? All right. The best way to get involved is to get out and vote, to register to vote. Young people like yourselves typically fail to vote because of lack of interest. You don't feel like it involves you. You have obstacles to absentee voting, like if you're not, if you're living in Salina, but you're from Western Kansas, are you able to get an absentee ballot? Are you able to register to vote? Those types of things. And it talks about how young people are typically, they have objections to partisanship. And partisanship is just this idea where you blindly support a political party and everything that political party does. You're starting to see the birth of or the growth of partisanship. It's been growing for a while. But with the with cable news and the 24-hour news cycle and 24-hour news cycle on the radio as well, politicians are less likely to step out of partisan roles for fear that they're going to be taken to task on those types of media outlets. So there we go there. Last thing we're talking about is factors for engagement. Many people hold latent preferences, like, hey, I think this should happen, but it's not an intense preference. It's not something that they really feel all that strongly about. And so when people are dealing with latent preferences, typically they're less likely to be politically involved versus an intense preference. They're typically more likely to get politically involved. If you look at like the hot button issues of the day, like Second Amendment rights, abortion rights, people are typically much more, they had much more intense preferences on that than they have on, let's say, like, I don't know, tax law. right? And although tax law probably affects your life more basically on a basic level than the other two, people have more intense feelings about those. So that's where we are. Make sure that you knock out the quiz and the reading and writing assignment for this, and we will see you guys in chapter 2. Look forward to the semester. Thanks. Bye-bye.